Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Fantastic. Okay. So. Okay, off we go. Iris, we're about to give you your usual job.
Well, I would be if... there it is.
It's coming,
Right,
it's coming. Patience,
enlarge
patience.
it.
There you go.
Okay. Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Right. God instructs Noah, the only righteous man in a world consumed by violence and corruption, to build a large wooden teva, ark, coated within and without with pitch. A great deluge, says God, will wipe out all life from the face of the earth, but the ark will float upon the water, sheltering Noah and his family and 2 members, male and female, of each animal species. Rain falls for 40 days and nights, and the waters churn for 150 days more before calming and beginning to recede. The ark settles on Mount Ararat, and from its window Noah dispatches a raven and then a series of doves to see if the waters were abated from the face of the earth. When the ground dries completely, exactly 1 solar year, 365 days, after the onset of the flood, God commands Noah to exit the teva and repopulate the earth. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices to God. God swears never again to destroy all of mankind because of their deeds, and sets the rainbow as a testimony of his new covenant with man. God also commands Noah regarding the sacredness of life. Murder is deemed a capital offense. And while man is permitted to eat the meat of animals, he is forbidden to eat flesh or blood taken from a living animal.
Okay, there's more. Here we go.
Noah plants a vineyard and becomes drunk on its produce. 2 of Noah's sons, Shem and Japheth, are blessed for covering up their father's nakedness, while his 3rd son, Ham, is punished for taking advantage of his debasement. The descendants of Noah remain a single people with a single language and culture for 10 generations. Then they defy their creator by building a great tower to symbolize their own invincibility. God confuses their language so that one does not comprehend the tongue of the other, causing them to abandon their project and disperse across the face of the earth, splitting into 70 nations. The Parsha of Noach concludes with a chronology of the 10 generations from Noah to Abram, later Abraham, and the latter's journey from his birthplace of Hasdim to Haran on the way to the land of Canaan.
Great, thank you very much. Just anyone watch the great
Rabbi,
yeah?
Rabbi, I
Yeah?
was reading the Parsha of Noah yesterday, and I noticed that, in point of fact, Abraham was not called from but from Haran. Terah had taken Abraham and Lot and Sarai to Haran.
Haran, yeah.
And
course,
it was from thence that Abraham was called to leave his family.
Yes.
So he was, although I've always thought that he was called to leave but they'd already left
I think according to the chronology of the 10 tests, one of them was leaving his birthplace, and then there are other ones along the way. So it's definitely a journey he took, but you are correct, yes. He was
but as I say, I'd always learned that he'd been called to leave and his father's house, and that he'd actually come from at that time. But I was very surprised to find that he'd already left with his father. Also, I noticed that his brother Haran had already died, and Lot, and that was presumably why Lot was living with Abraham. Right. And it seemed to me that Haran must have been, although he was mentioned 3rd in the group of brothers, Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Right. But he seemed to he must have been the eldest son, because Nahor, the other brother, married his daughter Milcah, Haran's daughter Milcah.
Yeah.
So presumably Haran was the elder son of the sons, and so that Nahor could marry Haran's daughter.
Makes sense.
Would that be?
Yeah.
Would I be right in my assumptions?
Sounds right. Sounds right. That sounds right. I've lost track. I lost track of one of the generations. Somewhere. You need to look at family tree. But it sounds right. Yeah, it sounds right. There's something else recently.
It's on the last page of the Parsha.
Ah, well, we didn't get there yet. I'm still at the beginning.
Yeah.
I'll probably get to it on Shabbos when I do the last Aliyah. It sounds right, chronology-wise, and what do you call it?
Logic.
Genealogy-wise. So just as a complete tangent, does anyone watch the Great British Bake Off here?
Yeah.
Right. Are you following the Rainbow Bagel controversy?
A bit, yeah. Well, I'm not really following it, but I think you mentioned it.
Yeah, I mentioned it. So I don't watch it, but I read in the paper somewhere that the controversy evidently was that somebody, I don't think he was Jewish, baked a bagel, which of course is a Jewish food. So there you go. That's what they call nowadays cultural appropriation. Not allowed to, why should somebody be allowed to bake bagels if they're not Jewish? Anyway, just said tongue in cheek. And they made the mistake of referring to, and they're a rainbow color. You can get them from Just Kosher. I'm sure it's not very healthy. It's full of food coloring. But anyway, made the mistake of referring to the rainbow as a symbol of the NHS and not a symbol of the LGBT movement, and caused a whole backlash. And I was rather bemused by all of this because the rainbow was never, the rainbow belongs to the story of Noah and the covenant with God. So if you want to talk about people pinching symbols from people, it got pinched from there and appropriated as a symbol of LGBT movement, etc. But it was originally a symbol of the covenant of God with the people. He wouldn't destroy the earth. Got nothing to do with any particular movement. So if you want to go down the route of saying that it belongs to any particular group, that's not true. Anyway, that's just in passing. If I would say that publicly, I would get in a lot of trouble probably these days. Right. Okay. Let's have a look at one particular aspect, which is very interesting, probably quite topical in many ways, particularly on the subject of. I touched on it, I think, on Shabbos, although I didn't get into it specifically in my sermon. But I spoke about, for those who possibly weren't there, I spoke about two mitzvahs, two concepts which are mentioned in Bereshis. One is the concept of connection with others, specifically with regard to Adam and Eve. Says it's not good for man to be alone, he needs a partner. But in general, we know that human beings crave connection with other human beings. And the other was the idea of saving a life. And we touched on that in relation to things like schools closing and activities closing and lockdowns and things like that. Although the topic this week really touches on things like how much is Judaism influenced by outside culture around it, or should it be? And we're going to have a look at that question. And different people give different answers to that. Obviously, some will say Judaism absolutely should have no outside influences whatsoever, and others are perhaps more in favor of outside influences, the kind of as modern orthodoxy, and Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, if you like, embraced the incorporation of outside influences into Jewish culture. If you'd ask a lot of people what modern orthodoxy is, they'd probably cite that as one example, is taking from the surrounding culture, as opposed to perhaps those cultures that sought to shut out the surrounding culture. We're going to have a look at what the Torah has to say about that. But it might be quite, I don't want to get too drawn on it. It's a huge and painful topic in some ways. But I'll just say I'll just quote this correctly. I saw a note going around. I'm on a group of people from the various Stanford Hill groups. I'm not sure how I got on them, but anyway, I saw a note going around from Hatzalah, which of course is the ambulance service, staffed by volunteers from the community. Message from Hatzalah. Last week, we transported a total of 70 people to hospital with bad COVID symptoms. Some are, God forbid, in very serious condition. Over this past Shabbos, we transported a further 16 people. Capital letters. Please be careful. Please follow all updated government guidelines to keep yourself, your family, and the elderly safe and well. Sounds quite sensible. That's the advice a lot of communities are giving, as to what the chief rabbi, I'm sure, United Synagogue would say. But of course, in many communities, people aren't taking all this stuff so seriously. That one of the, which is so ironic, because saving lives is paramount in Torah. But one of the issues in the States is very much the sort of idea that you hear of people saying, well, we're not going to let the government tell us how to lead our lives, which is when one tries to disengage dispassionately from one's feelings about things like people being in danger. I can sort of understand why when people see 50,000 people gathered protesting that Black Lives Matter, and that's okay. But if someone has a minion of more than 50 people, I think it is currently in Brooklyn, the police will come and shut them down. You've got people saying, well, if we start protesting, are we allowed to stay open? Now, I and many others like me say that's kind of missing the point. The point is that the protesters are pretty stupid as well, because they're putting their lives at risk of spreading corona. You don't have to spread it in your shul just because people have chosen to go and protest. However, you can sort of understand why people start to become a bit skeptical. It's like people saying, how come I'm allowed to go have a meal but not have but only if it's a heavy meal with, and how come I can do this but I can't do that? So one of the problems is a lack of public confidence in things. But leaving that aside, I think for some of the Jewish communities, there's a very genuine question as to, are we dictated to by outside influences or not? So those who feel we shouldn't be dictated to by outside influences feel that it's not the role of anyone else to tell us how to lead our lives. And that includes things like telling us we can't open our yeshivas or cheder because of the risk of coronavirus. And people say, well, I'm sorry, but we're not going to listen to you, because it's important that we study Torah. So I think that's misguided in many ways. But it might also come down to this kind of discussion. How much do we allow outside influences? And remember, in Israel, outside influences for many in the Haredi community includes the Israeli government. So if the Israeli government comes out with something, there's immediately a kind of an equal and opposite reaction to that from some in the Haredi community saying, oh, if the government's saying it, it must be a bad thing, right? Which is sad. So it might be a very topical subject. How much do we take from surrounding culture? We're going to have a look at that in a minute. Just to give an example of perhaps how things can get slightly absurd. There is a very well-known principle, something called Chukat HaGoyim, that we're not supposed to emulate the other nations, okay? Did you know that making a chuppah inside a shul, a quick quiz question. Pam and Julian, all three of your children, thank God, got married. Did any of them get married in a shul?
No.
Right. Jeff and Brenda, when your son got married in Israel, or when Mordechai got married, did he get married in a shul?
No.
Right. Okay. I did not get married in it. Well, I did get married in a shul. I got married outside. So if you ask most people where the marriages take place, they'll tell you in shul. But actually, that was never the traditional place for marriages. We don't have a bris might take place in shul if it's after davening. We don't do weddings in shul. The only reason we ever did weddings in shuls was we were copying the non-Jews who did weddings in church. In Jewish history, weddings were never done in shul. They were done outside, or failing that, they were done in wedding venues. They weren't done in shuls. Shuls were used for davening. So there are those who are of the opinion that getting married in shul is chukas hagoyim. It is copying non-Jewish practices, and you shouldn't do it. I was at a wedding personally with Rav Schneebach, who's the Rav in Edgeway Machzika Das, was insistent that if the wedding took place in shul, there had to be a proper mechitza between the ark and the chuppah to signify the fact that this was not a shul function. So, and yet many people get married in shul. They don't realize. I'm not saying it's bad, by the way, because it's become common practice, but it's a practice that originates from non-Jewish culture. Wearing black ties to funerals and wearing black to funerals is a non-Jewish practice, right? In the more traditional world, people don't wear black, right? You're seeing it more and more, by the way, that you go to Levi's and people do wear black suits and black ties. I suspect that they assume that's the right thing to do. Putting flowers on graves, we know, is a non-Jewish practice. We've never done that. So there are things that are non-Jewish practices that we generally don't take on, sometimes for the very specific reason that they are non-Jewish practices. The wearing of a kippah, the growing of your peyot, are very much things for men that stand out as distinctively Jewish, and we celebrate being distinctively Jewish. So, and the Torah does say you should not go in the ways of the nations around you, right? So there are Hasidic rabbis who preach that you shouldn't, when you buy glasses, you should buy an old-fashioned style, right? You shouldn't buy the latest trendy style, which has led to a rather interesting situation that in some quarters you used to see that people, when they got glasses, I think you see it even here in some of the Hasidic communities, they get what we used to, when I was a kid, they used to call NHS glasses with plastic frames, which were the free ones you got on the NHS. And unfortunately, I think some of us got probably teased for having them. And they've come back into fashion now, which is quite funny because there are a bunch of communities where people would go and get these kind of old-fashioned style dafka so they didn't look like trendy, and they've come back into fashion. Okay, so does not following the ways of the non-Jews mean that if non-Jews take medicine for illness, I shouldn't take medicine? Does that mean that if non-Jews say wear a mask because it saves your life, I shouldn't wear a mask? That if non-Jews are closing their restaurants because of COVID, I shouldn't close my shul because that is copying the ways of the non-Jews? So no, that's absurd. Copying the ways of non-Jews is cultural practices. So believe it or not, yes, you shouldn't have a tree on December 25th, even if you think it's purely secular. But medical or scientific or cultural practices that are there for safety or for common sense, right? I don't have to stop at traffic lights because non-Jews stop at traffic lights. So I'm copying the non-Jews. That's absurd. That's stupid. To stop at traffic lights because it's a law that protects people, right? I don't necessarily have to wear the latest designer sunglasses that all the celebrities are wearing just to be like them. Maybe that's chokas hagoyim, maybe, or particular fashion or particular trends. But so when we talk about culture, and it's a very sensitive subject for many in the more religious community, most of us would say you have to apply a little bit of common sense. I understand that one shouldn't adopt non-Jewish culture, right? The whole canonicals is an interesting one. Because in the United Synagogue 50, 60, 70 years ago, everyone wore canonicals. It came straight from the church. How could you wear them? Right? People on the right would poke fun at that. Interestingly, a lot of Chazanim still wear them. You see, even the very from Chazanim, like in Israel, when they have in the Great Synagogue, when they show the slichas and things, they all wear the Chazan hat and the robes. Right? It doesn't have a Jewish origin. It became a Jewish thing. Right? People are very fond of pontificating about the wearing of long black coats by rabbis and others. But it came from Eastern European aristocracy. It wasn't a Jewish custom. It was adopted as a mode of Shabbos dress. So there are many things we do take from surrounding culture. So this is what we're going to discuss today. And if you would go to different communities, they would have very different views on this. So we're going to have a look at this in context of this week's Parsha, because there is an interesting line which very much touches on this. Are we a light to the nations? Do we take light from the nations? Do we absorb from the nations? Do we have to live in our own bubble in the old-fashioned sense? Or the answer is probably a combination. Let's see. Okay, so in this week's Hedra, oh, that went wrong, never mind. Right, we have a phrase in chapter 6, verse 16. It says that you should make a tzohar. Oh, sorry, it's gone again. Try to get it back. Okay, who would like to read source number 2? Any volunteers?
I'll do it if you like, Rabbi.
Please.
Make a tzohar for the ark and terminate.
Oh, sorry. It's gone. I pressed the wrong key. 1 second. Get it back to you. Sorry, try again.
Oh, we've gone back to that again.
Is it back now? Make a tzohar. Sorry.
Make a tzohar for the ark and terminate it within the cubit of the top. Midrash Rabbah. Some say this was a window. Others say it was a precious stone that gave light to them.
Okay. So in the description of the making the ark in the first aliyah of this week's Sedra, the first portion says, amongst other things, it says you have to smear it with the tar and pitch, right? I don't know how they made it in those days, by the way. They didn't have modern technology, but how to build the ark and what size to build it. And at the end, it says you should make a tzohar, right? It's deliberately not translated here, and it should finish within a cubit of the top. So it seems like it's a high window or a skylight. So the Midrash says, some say it was a window, or some say it was a precious gem that sparkled that gave light out, right? There's a fundamental difference here, obviously, right? A window generally is to let light in, whereas some kind of a light that's giving light to the outside would be very different, right? Question. So far, in the scheme of things, when you think about the flood and the animals and Noah and Mrs. Noah and all the little kids and all the other things going on, how relevant does it seem to the story whether something that was located high up on the wall of the ark was actually some kind of a precious jewel that gave light, or a window that let light in from outside? How relevant is that? Does it seem particularly relevant?
To see.
Sorry?
Can you hear me? Oh,
we can hear you, yeah.
Oh, yes. Presumably that there was such rain and darkness outside, they would need some sort of light to see where they were.
Okay, so fair point. You might need a light source, yes? Quite possibly. But in the scheme of things, the lighting system is not mentioned anywhere else. So I think we have to assume that it's a metaphor. It doesn't appear anywhere else in the Torah, by the way. So sohar, I think, means to glint or to glisten. So everyone agrees that it means some kind of a light. By the way, there's a movement in Israel called sohar, which some think is great and some on the right complain about. But basically, sohar is a modern Orthodox group which say that their stated purpose is to make things like marriage and rabbinate processes more palatable, more accessible to people. So I'm guessing that it comes from the idea of shining a light on things, of being enlightened, probably. I'm assuming that's how they would translate it. Okay, so some say it was a window, some say it was some kind of a light that was actually a lamp that gave out light. Now, a window obviously only lets in light when it's light outside, whereas a separate light source would give out light. Okay. Why does it matter? Let's see. Who'd like to read the Bartanura, who besides being a winemaker was also a commentary?
I'll read. Relax.
Please, yeah.
What is at stake between the two interpretations is the etymology of the word Zohar itself. One relates it to the word Zaharayim, which means midday. In that case, the brightness was to come from the sun, the sky, the outside. Therefore, Zohar means a window, a skylight. The other view is that Zohar is related to Zohar, radiance, which suggests something that radiates its own light, hence the idea of a miraculous precious stone.
Right, so can we see the metaphor? Are we talking about something that lets in light from outside? Outside could have many, many meanings. Right, or you talk about something that is self-sufficient. Okay, does anyone have a room in their house that has no windows?
Yeah.
Right, you've got a bathroom somewhere. Yeah, you've got
shower room.
Right.
Yeah.
So I remember the first time I came across a bathroom that had no windows. It was a really strange idea that if you don't put the light on, it's completely dark. Because normally you think of a room as having light. When you look at it like an empty house, you have light. It might not be that light, but you have light from the street. Even at night, you have light. But if you have a room that has no windows, then you have no light, and you rely on artificial light. So is a tzahar like Saharayim? Acharei Tzarayim is afternoon, right? So Tzarayim is midday, is when the sun is shining in the sky. I'm not sure the exact translation of Tzahar, but does it mean something that lets the sun in, or does it mean something that radiates light out? Okay, that's so the Bartanura says that the debate about it being a light or a window, essentially, let's call it a light for now. Is it a light or is it a window? Right? The difference being a light gives light to the outside, a window brings light from the outside. So Bartanura says it depends how you understand the word. Let's see what other commentaries say. So Chizkuni is another commentary, and others who would like to read that. Any volunteers?
Shall I read it?
Please.
Yeah. Noah had both a window from which he later released a raven and some form of artificial lighting for the prolonged period of the flood itself, when the sun was completely overcast by cloud and the world was shrouded in darkness.
Right, interesting. So when he lets the raven go, it says he let the raven go. How did he let the raven go? From the ark. So he must have had a window. It's described actually in Bereshit. On the other hand, they would have needed some source of light. So how this light worked, apparently it was miraculous. But as you said earlier, what happens when it's dark? And particularly when you have a flood, right? What do we say when it rains? That the sky is overcast. So that's not going to give you much light. So Chizkuni says, very simple. They have both. Who cares? Who cares? God said there's never going to be another flood in the world. So who really cares? You know, in the scheme of things, we're concerned with the existence of the world and God not punishing us and the promise of the rainbow. Who cares what kind of window the ark had? So clearly it is a much more profound message than that. Let's have a look at Hebrew. Anyone know what the ark is called in Hebrew?
Teva.
Thank you. Teva, yes. What does Teva mean? Let's have a look. Right. So 3 meanings given here. Beryl, would you like to read? Can you see that?
No, thank you.
Oh, okay. Right.
Okay, I will. Okay, it's not much.
Yeah.
The ship built by Noah according to God's command as related in the Bible. 2, container or box. 3, word.
Right, thank you. So a teva, by the way, is used to describe where Moshe was put in a basket as well. So a teva is either a box or a ship, an ark, or it can be a word. Right? A teva is a word. It's the same spelling. Interesting. So teva can mean a word, or I don't know if anyone's ever heard this phrase, but when God says to Noah, go to the teva, people often use this as a metaphor. Go to the words of prayer. In other words, go in the same way that Noah's ark was an oasis in the in the storms of the flood. So when a person is having a busy day in life, go lose yourself in prayer. Meaning, go to it's a place of sanctuary. The ark was a place of sanctuary. The words of prayer, davening, the minyan when you go at lunchtime and daven mincha in the middle of your busy day, or in the morning, first thing before you start your busy day, or in the evening at the end of your busy day. It is a refuge, it's a sanctuary. So that's often used as an allusion. Go to the, say El HaTeva, God says to Noah, go to the ark and protect yourself and shield yourself. So people say, go to the words of prayer and use that to cocoon yourself. So words are tevot. Why is this relevant? Now let's feed that back into the question. The teva, we're told, the ark, had a tzohar. What was a tzohar? Was it a source of light that gives light outwards, or was it a window that lets light in? Now look at the word teva, meaning the words of Torah. Okay? So when it comes to the words of Torah, when it comes to our Torah, when it comes to Yiddishkeit, are we outward looking? Do we absorb from outside, or are we inward facing? So in other words, the window or the light that we have on our Torah learning, is it a light that shines outwards? In other words, we don't let anything in from outside. We purely give out to the outside, right? We have our own little bubble and we do what we do, and hopefully it gives light to the world. That's great and everything, but not to be in any way affected by the outside world, which is probably what a lot of the sort of Haredi community in Israel would say. The idea of learning constantly and not having the internet and not going to the army and not reading the media. And just by the way, one of the things I do wonder, which I haven't figured out an answer to, is how does everyone know all the new tier 2, tier 3, tier 1 government rules, rule of 6? Because we follow the news. If you did not follow the news, if you were not online and you didn't get a newspaper, no one's putting flyers through your door telling you the rules, right? So if you were a person, and you don't have to be I'm sure we all know somebody that's not very computer literate, that's not really online. There's a lot of older people who don't have access necessarily to the internet. So unless you get your newspaper every morning or you listen to the news, okay, if you listen to the news, fine. But some people don't listen to the news, and particularly some people in religious communities or otherwise don't listen to the news. If you don't listen to the news,
don't.
Right, there you go. So how are you supposed to know
No,
what the new rules are?
I don't listen to the news.
So how do you know what the rules are?
They actually give you an alert. I get an alert on my phone.
Only because yeah, but what if you don't have a smartphone? What if you don't use it?
It wasn't a smartphone. Yeah. I've got it on my...
Oh, it's a text. Okay. So the truth is there are many ways of communicating nowadays. But if someone is the sort of person that's not really digital, then it's quite possible you wouldn't know the rules. I don't think my parents follow news online. I think they listen to probably the radio news, so they probably hear it on the radio news. That's the truth. But there is a genuine possibility in some communities people actually don't hear. That's another problem. They're not exposed to news, and we rely on news.
Yes, but I think it's more by word of mouth, because I'm trying to avoid the news because I don't want to listen to all the bad news. But everybody keeps telling me all the bad news.
Right, it's like the football score when you get the football score. Okay, so
I don't listen to the news or read a newspaper or read the news at all, but I get on the in my emails I get government alert, government things. I actually put down for that. I get alerts every day about all sorts of government things, but it includes the COVID, which is all I'm actually interested in.
So this is an old question. when it comes to Judaism, not just Torah, the words of Torah, when it comes to us as a community, when it comes to us as a lifestyle, how much do we give out? How much do we absorb from outside? Right? And if we are a light, by the way, are we a light to the outside, or are we just a light to ourselves? Which is also an interesting question. Right? We now live in an age where if you go back 20, 30, 40 years, if you talk to the sort of ultra religious community about outreach, they would have said that's not for us. You know, we look after ourselves. In Israel, for example, now it is more common to have people from the Haredi community that are working in the mainstream. So it's far more likely that someone is going to go into their office one day or their place of work and encounter a more religious person, and they might well ask them questions. Why do you do this? Why do you do that? Right? And if that person takes great offense, I don't know, sometimes people post on social media, somebody posted they were very offended that one, I think it was a non-Jewish colleague, had asked them why they do something or something like that. And I think, like, why are you offended? I actually think this is, again, it comes back to the rainbow discussion. It's a terrible thing that if I see someone in the street wearing an orange turban, and I want to say, excuse me, I don't want to be rude, I'm really curious. You know, I work with a Sikh guy and he wears a blue turban. I notice you have an orange one. Do you mind my asking? I'm really curious about your faith and your culture. Is there a particular significance to the color? Some people get offended by that, and other people are quite fascinated to explain it. I personally, if somebody says, why have you got white strings hanging out of your trousers? I'm quite happy to explain something. I don't see a problem with that. Or can I ask you, I heard that some, you know, I watched Unorthodox. I heard that people do this and do that. Far better to educate people. Some people get very easily offended. They don't like being asked about their culture and whatever. I personally don't think it's offensive if it's done respectfully. I think it's how you learn about other cultures. So do we give out, or do even within our own community? You know, when somebody sees somebody who's more religious and they say, oh, you know, why can't you carry on Shabbat? And they say, because the Torah says so, leave me alone. Or do you sit down and say, oh, you know, I'd be happy to explain that to you. Thank you. Which builds friendships and builds bridges. So do we give light out? Which might sound obvious, but it's not. And there are many communities where people are very suspicious, very afraid of being asked questions like that. And do we absorb from outside? So this question, does a Tohar mean a light or a window? It's not just splitting hairs about a word in the Bible. It's a paradigm for different things, and particularly when we interpret the word teva, not just as the ark, but as the words, particularly the words of Torah, it becomes very relevant to how you approach life in general. Let's have a look at some different approaches. So, if it works, not working. Oh, no, I'm not. Right. So, what does everything exist in Torah? I finally got round to watching Srugim. Anyone else besides Pam and Julian watch Srugim?
Watch what?
Srugim. Srugim. A srugi is a kippa sruga, knitted kippa. So Srugim is the plural of basically like, you know, B'nai Akiva guys that wear knitted kippot. So it's basically a soap opera that was set in Katamon. It's kind of Friends. It's not as funny, but it's about this bunch of friends who are all basically like modern Orthodox, Dati Leumi, Shomer Shabbat, and they're all dating and they all do Friday night dinner together, and one's a doctor and one's it's actually quite fascinating. And there's one scene in there where there's a guy, it's in Hebrew with English subtitles. First of all, I love watching, I haven't watched this, or I'll get around to it, but I love watching a TV show with a bunch of guys in kippot, like davening. It's really Hamish. It feels really, anyway. So, and people lighting Shabbos candles. It's really cute. Anyway, I think you can get it on some of the platforms. I've got the DVD, which Pam Julian kind of gave me. I think it's series 2 and 3. If anyone wants to borrow it, I highly recommend it. It's very enjoyable, particularly because we relate to the characters in it. So there's a character in there. He's moved to Tel Aviv. He's like a religious guy. He wears his kippah, and on his bookshelf, he's got one shelf of like Talmud and one shelf of, I can't remember if it was Shakespeare or philosophy or something. And somebody says to him, did you deliberately do that? He says, you know, it's interesting. He says, I moved to Tel Aviv, and I thought, now I have to make a very clear distinction between, like, you know, the Kodesh and the Chol, the holy. And he said, it doesn't feel right to have the Talmud next to whatever it was, War and Peace, I think it was, you know. So I have a separate shelf, and I have my Hebrew books, and I have my sort of, if you like, secular books. So how do we engage? So there is a view that says that everything you need is in the Torah. You shouldn't look outside of Torah. Let's see what Pirkei Avot says about that, because I know you probably read this Mishnah before, and you may not have thought about what it means. But one clear meaning is that if you look hard enough, you'll find everything in the Torah. You might have to learn all the commentaries and all the whatever, but everything is in Torah. Who hasn't read for a while? Iris, you want to read again? Oh, Mark, sorry, Mark, go on.
Yeah. Ben Bag said, turn it over and again, turn it over, for all is therein, and look into it and become grey and old therein, and do not move away from it, for you have no better portion than it.
I don't know before about what this actually means, but it basically means leave no stone unturned, right? Thrash the Torah around and turn it upside down and you know, argue and question, and basically if you turn it over enough times, you will find everything you need to find in it. So if you leave no stone unturned, if you delve into it hard enough and you look into it, you'll become old and grey with it. In other words, it's all you need for life. That's what Ben Bambag seems to be saying. You don't need anything else. Torah, don't move away from it. There's nothing better than that. So no, you don't need science, you don't need art, you don't need music, or you don't need philosophy. You just need Torah. It's all in the Torah. Everything's in the Torah. There's a story I may have told before. A couple of guys I know that were in yeshiva in Israel. One of them was like a maths graduate at quite a high level, I think Princeton or something. He gone to yeshiva for a bit, and it was Hanukkah time, and they went to Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and they knocked on. They had like some of the menorahs in the boxes they have in Chabad, and they knocked on doors and said to people, you know, do you have a menorah? Do you want a menorah for Hanukkah? We're just giving out donuts, whatever it was. And one guy says, I haven't got time now. I'm doing my maths homework or something. So this guy says, well, maybe I can help you. He says, you're a yeshiva bacher. What do you know about mathematics? He says, let me have a look. So he has a look and he helps him solve the problem very quickly. So the guy's absolutely astonished. He says to him, how on earth did you know that? This is advanced, you know, postgraduate degree level mathematics. So the guy says in Hebrew, Hakol Katov B'Torah V'Gemara. That means everything is written in the Torah and the Talmud. So the guy's like, whatever, it's not quite true, obviously. It's cute. There is a certain truth to it. You won't get all the advanced mathematics you get in university from the Torah, but you'd be surprised what you can learn from the Torah and from the Talmud. So this is one view. One view is we don't need to look outside. Right? Now you can ask me, how would it work with Jewish doctors and Jewish lawyers if everybody studied Torah all day? I have no idea. But this is one view. One view is you don't need external influences, right? It's the light that shines inside. You don't need windows to let in the light from outside. There is no light outside. All the light comes from inside. And if you think about Jewish history for a moment, you know, Lord Sachs, who I don't know if everybody noticed, he's having some treatment for cancer at the moment, and I'm sure amongst many other people I wish him well. As somebody who is an incredible teacher in my own life, his Hebrew name is Yaakov Tzvi Ben Liba, I should have a refuah shlema. He actually wrote a very beautiful piece about which I'll share, about his father and being ill and how basically never dwelt on it. And you know, some people when they're ill, they learn lessons from it and so on. He said his father just basically got on with his life. Anyway, but you know, Lord Sachs's teaching is very popular. We live in a generation where Jewish teachings are sometimes in the mainstream. You know, the Kabbalah, it's died down a bit now, but with Madonna, the Kabbalah Center was very popular. You know, if you go back to Eastern Europe in the 1930s, you know, in Germany, no one was learning Jewish teachings. They were busy killing Jews. So sometimes we have to be introverted. We have to be introspective,
inclusive,
inward looking.
inclusive.
No, I'm thinking more exclusive. We have to be inward looking by definition, because even if you seriously believe that Judaism was this wonderful lifestyle that you wanted to preach to the whole world, even the non-Jews, they were too busy trying to kill you. So you basically were staying away from them. So I mean, I say that tongue in cheek, but it's true. So for a lot of Jewish history, that was the case. We now live in slightly more enlightened times where there is a fascination with religious things and Jewish things and so on. So Ben Bagbag's view that you'll find everything you need in the Torah, first of all, might be out of necessity, you know, the kind of shtetl, the shtetl mentality, or it might be also an ideology. It could be both. The truth is, it could be both, right? It's an ideology. It's the ideology that eschews secular studies at all costs, right? And it's an interesting topic of discussion that in many communities, it's quite common, let's say, in a Hasidic community in New York, or probably in Israel, or in London. Of course, you have doctors, you have accountants, right? And generally they come from outside the community, or they are balei tshuva, people who became more religious after going to university. So it's not necessarily a sustainable model. So if you'd ask people in those communities, how do you expect to have doctors in your community if no one goes to medical school? I'm not sure they've got an answer to that. But anyway, we'll park that thought for the moment. So this is one view. This is Ben Bagbag. He's quite inward looking, it seems. He says, he doesn't say turn it over, and if you don't find it in the Torah, go look to the wisdom of the other nations around you. You may learn wonderful things from them. He says, don't move away from it. There's no better portion. Let's see what Maimonides, though, says. Let's have a look at Maimonides. Who hasn't read?
Rabbi, can I ask you a question, Rabbi?
Yeah.
Rabbi?
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
I didn't hear, who's Ben Bagbag?
Okay, Ben Bagbag, I can't remember how he got his name. It was an abbreviation. He's one of the rabbis in the Mishnah. It was an abbreviation. I can't remember what for. I can look it up. I'll look it up where it came from. In the meantime, who would like to read Maimonides?
I haven't read yet.
Right. Sorry, Pam, go for it. This is a very different view from Maimonides. Who, of course, by the way, was a doctor and a philosopher and an expert in the sciences. So, yeah.
Okay. Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. What is the path to attain love and fear of him? When a person contemplates his wondrous and great deeds and creations and appreciates his infinite wisdom that surpasses all comparison, he will immediately love, praise, and glorify him, yearning with tremendous desire to know God's great name. As David stated, my soul thirsts for the Lord, for the living God. That's from Tehillim. When he continues to reflect on these same matters, he will immediately recoil in awe and fear, appreciating how he is a tiny, lowly, and dark creature, standing with his flimsy, limited wisdom before he who is of perfect knowledge. As David stated, when I see your heavens, the work of your fingers, I wonder, what is man that you should recall him? Based on these concepts, I will explain important principles regarding the deeds of the Master of the Worlds to provide a foothold for a person of understanding to develop love for God. As our sages said regarding love, in this manner you will recognize he who spoke and thus brought the world into being.
Right, so in case that wasn't clear, what's Maimonides saying? And I want to just summarize that in about one line. Okay, he doesn't say it so clearly here, but elsewhere he says clearly. What he's basically trying to tell us is that through a multiplicity of different channels, obviously including Torah, but including science and art and philosophy and, you know, natural beauty, he says, when a person contemplates his wondrous and great deeds and creations and appreciates his infinite wisdom that's past all comparison, so that's not, maybe it's not entirely clear here, but he's not just talking about Torah, he's talking about all types of knowledge. I remember he was a scientist, he was a medic, he was a philosopher. So he says, you know what, this is how you will recall God. You will appreciate him through the many brilliant fields of study. So according to Maimonides, people of the book doesn't have to only mean people of Torah, it can mean people who are study generally, study different disciplines and different wisdoms. Right? We're not talking about studying like idolatrous practices. We're talking about things that a person will do. It says, you know, says Maimonides, through science, a person will come to appreciate God in his world, right? Through the brilliance of other disciplines. So a completely different view. You've got one view that basically says, look for everything you need in the Torah. You've got another view that says, incorporate from outside.
But Maimonides was a doctor, wasn't he?
He was a doctor.
He did that.
You could say, right, he absolutely did that. Now you could say, okay, he was a doctor, he saved lives, that's an exception. But his philosophy is clear that in order to understand, you have to have this appreciation, you have to have these fields of knowledge, right? It's not, this is not the best quote, actually, there are better quotes. But he's basically saying that wisdom, when he says wisdom, he's not just talking Torah, different fields of disciplines rather, science and technology and, you know, the arts and different things that help a person to appreciate God's greatness. He does say for the purpose of appreciating God's greatness. So, you know, somebody once asked about Rebbe for his life in outer space. I believe the answer he gave was I don't know if there's life in outer space. Some people say that it would be very problematic from a Torah point of view if there's life in outer space, because we say that this is the world that God created for us to inhabit and so on and so forth. But anyway, the Rebbe said, but we absolutely have an obligation to explore God's creations. So space travel, in theory, I mean, there's all kinds of issues with funding and so on, but the concept of exploring space gives a person an appreciation of how amazing Hashem is. Look at this infinite world that's, you know, that's boundless, this endless universe. It's so brilliantly put together. How can I fail to think that God is incredible with what he's created? So, you know, the whole idea of natural beauty, the brachas you make when you see a beautiful tree, you know, or a natural phenomenon, the Grand Canyon, there's a bracha you say. Why? Because it helps us. What are you doing looking at the Grand Canyon? Go stick your nose in a book and study Torah. What are you doing in rockets? Go stick your nose in a book. You know, what are you doing playing music or looking at art or looking at natural beauty or, you know, any of these things? Go stick your nose in a book and study Torah. So the answer is, for some people who study Torah constantly, then maybe they shouldn't stop. But for those of us, there is definitely a discussion. If, you know, let's say someone's going to go to medical school, but they're a brilliant Torah scholar. Okay, there are a certain percentage of people who are brilliant Torah scholars. They might make really good doctors. But for the average person, you know, people say things like, you know, there's a famous joke about the guy, it's not really funny, but the guy who's at a demonstration in Israel, right? People like to go to demonstrations all the time. He bumps into his old rabbi from the kollel. And the rabbi says, Yankel, how's it going? He says, Rebbe, I have to tell you the truth. I'm not studying in kollel. I'm not studying in yeshiva anymore. It didn't work out for me. I just don't have a head for study. He says, but don't worry, I'm not working, right? So the premise being that God forbid you should go to work, right? As opposed to, if you are an exceptional student, even Ben Gurion recognized that you need to have exceptional students studying, just like you need to have people doing research in the secular field. That's not the same as, it's a misunderstanding, ironically, right? So a person say, you know, if I'm studying Torah all day and I'm an absolute genius in Torah, then I should stay in that field. But if I'm not, says Maimonides, there are other ways to appreciate God through different disciplines. So that would be the more kind of, yeah.
Right, so like with art, like somebody like Malka, she's got like a beautiful way with her of appreciating the Torah through the art that she does.
Right. So of course that's the ultimate benefit, is to use your science or your art or your music to serve God, right? So, you know, you have people who are musicians who became more religious who start playing Jewish music. You have artists who are religious who express themselves, you know, so in many, you're right, in many ways, something can be channeled into a more kind of Jewish viewpoint. But it goes further than that, because even, let's say, just, you know, for a Chol Hamoed outing, would you go to the Tate Gallery? Let's assume that the pictures are modest, that they're not, I don't know, nude or whatever, right? Would you go to the Tate Modern? It's got a big row going on at the moment, I think. Actually. Anyway, would you go to the Tate Modern? Or would you say, Chas v'shalom, God forbid? No, absolutely not. That's wrong, right? Or would you go to a museum, see history? Or would you go to the Science Museum, see science? Right? And the truth is, many people do. You go on Chol Hamoed, many people, including from the religious communities, people go to the Science Museum. Now, people have varying opinions about science, but they do go there. I personally think it's quite an incredible experience. It gives you, if you have the right mindset about these things, then it all gives you a greater appreciation, as Maimonides says, of the wonders of Hashem's world. Right? You know, a good piece of music that you lose yourself in, whether that's for you is klezmer or a nigun, or maybe, yes, it's classical or jazz, or a good piece of art that you know, really absorbs you, or, you know, yes, a play or a poem or a story or something that is enriching to you, can actually give you a greater appreciation of God's creation. You know, we can serve God through poetry, through fiction, through all these things. We can serve God in these ways. Some people say you can't. So I guess there's actually two issues. There's the cultural aspects of art and music and sort of, you know, writings and how you relate to them. And then there's the sort of the knowledge aspect, so like studying different subjects. And some communities will say that it is an end in itself. They feel you should study literature and science and history and art. Some communities will not touch it at all. And some communities will say you can study it if it's for a profession. And you'll have everything in between.
Go on.
But coming back to the question, what was that window in the ark, the window on the words of Torah? So actually it makes a huge difference. Is it a light that shines inward or even outwards? Or is it light from outside? So if you ask some people, they'll say it's absolutely not light from outside. you know, the ark had to be a shining light of morality and a sea of immorality. And others will say that you still need to let the light in from outside, right? But interesting point, you're letting the light in, you're not letting the darkness in. So you still have to be discerning about what you let in. So even if you do engage with the broader world from a sort of halachic religious point of view, you do have to have a certain discernment about what you digest and what you don't. But it's a very different view of how we see the Torah and how we see our Judaism, right? Is it something that's inward looking, which is how some people see it? Everything's in the Torah and we keep it inwards and we don't incorporate, and therefore we should dress the same way we would have dressed hundreds of years ago. We should follow the same customs. It's interesting because I've never heard anyone advocate that we shouldn't use technology. The Amish don't use technology, or they didn't. I think they do now. I've never heard anyone advocate that we shouldn't use technology. The most I've heard is people say we shouldn't go on the internet because it has loads of inappropriate stuff. You shouldn't wear the latest fashion because you shouldn't be a fashion victim. That's a non-Jewish kind of a thing. I've never heard anyone say that we should live in the 17th century, literally. You know, and it's funny, like with all that's going on with lockdown things, people say, well, my grandparents managed without meat because they lived in Europe under poverty. Okay, but we don't. We live in affluent times. So to say that just because our grandparents could only afford meat once a month means we should only have to have meat once a month, not necessarily. We don't live in those times. You don't have to hark back to those times. People lost a lot of children in infancy in those times as well. And people didn't live beyond 50 or 60 in those times. And there were pogroms in those times. We don't have to hark back to everything the way it was. So we can take ideas from outside. And perhaps coming back to the COVID discussion, this is why different communities deal with it in different ways. Because perhaps a large part of it, I don't believe there's any community that doesn't believe in pikuach nefesh, in saving lives. But communities have different relationships with the outside world. So a community that has a very suspicious relationship with the outside world, which in Israel could include the Israeli government, or even the modern Orthodox community for that matter, right? So they're not listening to some of those rabbis. It's interesting, there's a rabbi called Asher Wise, who's a brilliant rabbi. He's some kind of chassid of some kind. He gives a lot of talks, a lot of stuff in English. I'll tell you this, he's the posek for Hadassah Hospital, I think. No, for Shari Tzedek rather. So he gives all the halachic rulings. He's an absolute halachic genius. He's a very popular lecturer. People love his talks on YouTube and whatever. He talks a lot of sense, and a lot of what he says is certainly about saving lives and following rules and so on. So the Haredi community see him as too modern, even though he's really one of them, because obviously he must be too modern if he says you should follow government guidance. That's one of the problems you run into, right? As soon as you say something people don't like, they dismiss you by saying that, you know, you're not a proper Jew kind of thing. The answer, of course, really is that we know there are 70 faces to the Torah. The answer is that both interpretations are correct. A Torah could well be a light that shines inwardly. Certainly in times of persecution, in times of danger, we've always looked inwards. We've not looked to the outside world to save us. Right? And that's one of the problems, when we look to the outside world for solutions. On the other hand, though, in times of plenty and in good times, which we're essentially living in now, even though we're living in challenging times, a Torah can definitely be a window to the outside world that lets in the light from outside. There are always things we can take from outside. It would be absurd to suggest we shouldn't absorb and incorporate from outside. Now, how far you do that will depend on your outlook. Some people will say, that's fine for medicine and that's fine for, you know, science and technology where it helps me in my life, but I don't have to go to university. Other people will say that means I should go to university and study in order to have a fulfilling job in life. Other people will say I should go to university and study for the sake of study. And other people say I should stay in yeshiva and study Torah all day. You're going to have a full spectrum. Perhaps it comes down to these different interpretations. But there's certainly both different schools of thought, and you'll see different rabbis through the ages that, you know, embody different viewpoints on that. Chief rabbis, obviously, of this country have tended to have to be far more on the outward looking, you know, taking in from the outside. You wouldn't be the chief rabbi if you were very sort of Haredi. And this is where clashes occur. So, for example, the chief rabbi had to give guidance to schools on LGBT pupils. And because of that, he was pilloried by the far right because they said, you know, it's very simple. The Torah says this and we have to abide by it. And they don't occupy a space where they have to deal with these kinds of issues in the same way they probably don't have to deal with intermarriage or people who don't keep Shabbos. But some of us do have to occupy that space. So we have to be a little bit more aware of things. Right? It's like many other things. If you talk about racism and sexism and, you know, feminism, all these things, and people say, oh, fair, it's a goyish thing, you know, it's not a goyish thing to respect all created beings and have respect for people. That's a very Jewish value. Unfortunately, that's actually a very good example. Some elements of the Jewish community are very racist. There's no reason to be. There's no basis to that. So many, many things. we can take ideas from outside and we can still preserve our distinctive culture and identity. And you'll get different answers as to how to do that. But we see even from the interpretation of that one verse in the Torah, right? Why are all the rabbis discussing it? Not because they really care about the Noah's window, but because of it's a paradigm for how we live our lives and how we learn and how we incorporate things into our lives. I'm not saying there's a right and a wrong, by the way, because we've always survived because of those who make a fortress around their Torah study and their Yiddishkeit. That's what's kept us going ultimately through difficult times. But at the same time, that's not the whole Jewish community. The Jewish community runs the gamut from secular to ultra-Orthodox, and many people in between who are seeking an authentic Jewish lifestyle that is still, for them, compatible with modern life. There's no contradiction. So it's an age-old question. Maimonides discussed it in the 12th century. He obviously had his own view on it. Others discuss it. We didn't quote Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. You have then different movements. You have what they call Torah in Derech Eretz, which is the idea of Torah with a profession, with an occupation. You have Torah Umada, which is the idea of Torah with secular study. And then obviously you have perhaps more sort of undiluted forms of movements that, I don't know what they even call themselves, but more kind of ultra-Orthodox movements. And they all have a place in society. I'm not saying that one's wrong and one's right, because I don't think that's the way to go. I think that, there we go. Any questions, comments? We run over a bit. Sorry, it's quite late. I just say also, I think it's important that, I said before, if no one goes to university, who's going to become a doctor? But then if everyone goes to university, I'll give you another. It's interesting that in many of the more sort of, if you like, Hesder type yeshivas in Israel, you'll often find, I don't know about now, but certainly when I was there, a lot of the people teaching were from the kind of Haredi sector. And the reason for that was very simple, because the people that stay in yeshiva for 10, 20 years and go on to become Rabbonim and Dayanim are not the people who go to university. Right? Obviously, you can go to university and study as well. You have Bar Ilan, you have YU and things like that. But for a lot of people, they go to yeshiva for a year or two, and then they go off to study for a profession, which is perfectly valid and it's fine. But then you're not likely to go into the rabbinate with that. So who are the people that are filling the ranks of teachers in many yeshivot where the students are not from those communities, tend to be more Haredi rabbis, right? Who are the people that are filling a lot of the roles in the rabbinate, tend to be more ultra-Orthodox because they study for longer. It's a simple fact. So it's an interesting conundrum. So, and then by the same token, who are the doctors in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods? They're not ultra-Orthodox doctors, generally. They're either more likely to be modern Orthodox, or they'll be Baalei Teshuva, or they might be secular. So different communities feed into each other. And it works, because if everybody went to yeshiva, it wouldn't work, and if everyone went to medical school, it wouldn't work. So somehow it works. There's a balance. I think it works because everyone does their own thing. I think if you rock the boat too much, then the whole system would fall apart. I think that at the moment, it works okay. There are definitely problems, but it works. You need people that are studying yeshiva for years, otherwise you wouldn't have rabbinic leadership and Torah teachers. And you, by the same token, if everybody does it, it doesn't work. So I think the system, if you look at Israel, there's a lot of tensions and things, but I think the system works because different communities produce different talent. And if everyone said, you have to be like me, we all have to do this, we all have to do that, I think that's when it starts to go wrong, personally. Okie dokie. We've run over time, so I better let everyone get off to wherever you're going. And we'll hopefully be back next week, if not before. And I actually have a very nice book called Sohar Lateva, which is a play on words, obviously, of the window to the ark, which is basically a book of very diverse, like Divrei Torah on the Parsha. When I used to do the Friday night, like on the Parsha between Mincha and Maariv, I often get it from that book. It's got very, very diverse range of commentaries and things, and it's a very nice name for a book. I guess it's this idea that a Sohar is both a window in and it's a light shining out as well. You can have both at the same time.